I'm standing between you and a beer, so I will speak quickly. So thank you for staying. So as Joe Fish said, my name is Kirsten, and I've done this work with Carl DiSalvo at the Public Design Workshop Group, or PDW, at Georgia Tech around data design and civics in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a very large city in the southeastern part of the United States. So it was hard to pick just one emblematic image of Atlanta, and this is a shot from the International Space Station, and all it tells us is that Atlanta is big and it's kind of messy, and it has a few discernible patterns, but that's actually a pretty good introduction to Atlanta. It's a city that's marked by incredibly fast growth, a dearth of city planning, and no real geographic core. It's a city marked by growth and fragmentation, segregation, optimism, frustration, so it's like a lot of cities. But as a collection of contradictions where problems and promises intertwine, Atlanta is an interesting site for examining the problems and promises of civic tech. And for the last several years, PDW has been actively involved in working with local communities using speculative and public design as a way of exploring technology and civics. And we'll share more about that in a talk tomorrow that Carl will be presenting. So to inform this particular study, we looked at language and practices of civic technology in the popular press, in HCI and related disciplines, in the city of Atlanta, and in our own work. For example, this was a model that we found from a group called the Knight Foundation, and they did a landscape of civic technology. And we found it to be really instructive in terms of how they semantically mapped certain civic technologies together, what they grouped together, what technologies they left out of the landscape, what technologies were attracting capital and momentum, and which ones were struggling to find any kind of an audience. We also looked at movements across HCI and related fields, noting that the history of civic technology could be either really long and deep, or relatively recent and more specialized, depending on how you defined it. We noted the emergence of whole fields that could be considered civic tech, such as urban interaction design, and the reshaping within existing fields, such as participatory design. Within HCI, we projected that the turn to civics was a logical next move from the turn to the social and a turn to the cultural, such as how Ian spoke about it earlier. And in our review of the literature, we saw calls for the promise of new technology that was going to shape and advance social progress, and at the same time, we noted documentation and questioning around technology's darker side. So from this background, we wanted to look specifically at how Atlanta leaders on the ground, how were they approaching civic technology? Were they embracing it wholeheartedly? Were they appropriating it in familiar and perhaps expected ways? Were they embarking slowly and cautiously? What was the mix of approaches that we'd see on the ground? But we also had an underlying question, and this was based on some of our initial work with government entities and with civic action groups. We were wondering what the appetite was for our kind of approach to design, so an approach that focused on mid to far future horizons, a more speculative approach. Would that be something that would be appealing to groups that were literally and figuratively concerned with putting out day-to-day fires? So our way into unpacking some of these questions was to pull back from any one existing civic technology platform or program, and instead to work from these sort of more abstract concepts and use data, design, and civics as building blocks. What we did is we spoke with a bunch of local leaders. We analyzed transcripts, looked for themes that we then presented back to our participants for feedback and refinement. So we started by identifying a handful of civic leaders across different spaces who we either knew or who referred to us. And then those initial contacts recommended additional possible people for us to speak with, and we ended up with a core group of 13 people from 10 different organizations. We interviewed each participant for approximately an hour, and for some then we engaged with follow-up conversations via email. As we started talking with our participants, we realized they were falling into roughly two overlapping groups. One group that was concerned with what we'd call the spirit of civics, and one group that was concerned with the business of civics. And we had some overlap there, where some who were oriented towards both, and some who actually sat in both circles. So Jay worked as a public employee during the week, and on the weekends he would often volunteer in civic action groups. So this translated into 3 voices that participants move between: a volunteer voice, a connector voice, and a provider voice. Some participants would at times speak from different voices. Our sample size is too small to make any sort of definitive claims about these different voices, but we can make some general observations, and we just flag it here as sort of interesting to think about how these different roles intermingled and intertwined. So I'm going to share now some of the highlights from our results in 3 sections: perceptions, looking ahead, and emergent themes. Wow, I really am going fast. All right, so first in terms of overall perceptions of the space, one of our initial motivating questions that we wanted to uncover was whether civic leaders were approaching civic tech as a boom or a bust. And this quote from H as a provider is a nice barometer. She was worried that someone was going to pull back the curtain, and in reality they would see that the height of civic tech innovation was that they had a workable website. And here, L, coming from the connector voice, was describing a data stalemate that they were often running up against, where one group would be like, yes, we have data, what data do you want? And the group that was possibly going to use the data would say, well, yeah, we need data, but what data do you have? Or in this last quote from C, as a volunteer, he was really questioning how much people actually really wanted to engage with government and how much they really wanted to work with the data that was available. So all of these quotes suggest a kind of, for our participants, a kind of cautious pragmatism, a sense that civic tech is a reality that holds promise, but it's not quite there, or a sense that the possibility exists for doing really great, new, innovative civic things, but the path to get there was not so direct. So we also tried to get a sense whether perceptions of data, design, and civics were uniform across these different voices that we'd identified. And we found mainly some similarities with some nuances. But for the most part, data was considered an input or an output, and it was mainly measurements collected and maintained by public bodies. Design was seen as a profession. It was pointed to as, oh, well, we did design because we had a graphic designer on our team, or it was a process. And civics was the motivation or the context behind their work. So we began each of our interviews by asking people to talk to us about their perceptions of what is data, design, and civics, and we ended by asking them to look forward. What were they expecting to be issues in the future? So there was some discussion offered by our participants about further afield futures, about what happens, like, for example, for transportation issues, like parking and traffic monitoring when autonomous or automated vehicles became commonplace. So this was sort of a far-out future that they had an easier time talking about and imagining. But discussions about more near-term challenges, things that were 3 to 5 years out or things that were happening now but at a smaller scale, it was more difficult for them to scale and conceptualize. So they talked about big data and Internet of Things as things that they felt they understood in theory, but they didn't fully appreciate the possible implications or how they would go about building a strategy around them. We talked to the team from the mayor's office about a possible future where citizens might have their own measurements of things like air or water quality and what that would mean for them. They started talking about that as a future of data versus data, whereas now it's one of anecdote versus data. And they knew that this would cause some difficulties and it would shift the landscape and there would be some power dynamics, but they had no idea how they were going to prepare for that. And finally, so if we talked about perceptions and we talked about looking ahead, these were things that we asked our participants to talk about specifically. I'm now going to share with you some of the emergent themes that came out from when they were just discussing things that were important to them and following the shape of that discussion. So these themes or issues raised by our participants ran the spectrum from day-to-day problems to more strategic opportunities or aspirations. We identified 4 in the paper: access, fragmentation, guiding metaphors, and literacy. In the interest of time, I'm going to just gloss over the fragmentation and guiding metaphors. Fragmentation was mainly to do with the fact that our city is very decentralized, and this led not to creative redundancy, but to inefficiencies and lack of awareness about what was going on across different counties and jurisdictions. The guiding metaphor theme was interesting because it revolved around how the civic tech space tended to draw on comparisons with startups and entrepreneurship as models for growth and innovation. Yet these models did not often fit with civic capacity or with the time frame that some of our other speakers have talked about. So I'm going to turn now to some of the other themes that came up. So one of the themes was access, and I've pulled some quotes for you to skim through. So W talked about a frustration with just a lack of access to data in general. So he was like, everyone's talking about big data. We just don't even have data, big or little. And in this quote, L, as a volunteer or connector, was describing how access can be really tenuous, and that sometimes you wanted to be really careful about how you use the access to certain data, or else you might get shut out. And then this last quote, S, from a connector, she was talking about challenges in making data just more accessible. She talked about, I'm just not wired to think in terms of how do I make data public. So in our sample, access was mainly construed in terms of data access, and it was mainly presented as a problem, and either because the data simply wasn't there, or it was there but it was misused, or you had data but you didn't know how to get it out to people in the right format or to the right people. Another big emergent theme for us was around the idea of literacy, which, like access, tended to focus on data literacy, and I'll share some more quotes here. So M, from a connector voice, spoke about data being all around us, and because of that it was overwhelming. And he later observed that his clients they didn't know what questions to ask in order to use data effectively for civic decisions. So whereas M was highlighting the limitation in people's abilities to interpret data, this quote from L talks about the failing to understand what the limits of data are. And this third quote gets at more technology literacy in general. So S shared about her struggle to think in terms of data and technology. She spoke at length about not knowing how to choose between different viable platforms because she didn't understand how do I evaluate all the possible implications of these different technological paths. And finally, I've just pulled a fourth quote about literacy that's kind of more specific and general at the same time. So R was a data scientist, and he was really excited about teaching kids to think statistically or algorithmically or computationally. He felt that this needed to happen at a much younger age, and it should be a competency that we all share, not just those who do data. I'm flagging it because I was really sort of intrigued by his notion of some truths are more important than others, and that's based partly on their probabilities. It kind of sets up nicely our discussion and when we reflected on some of these issues that our participants brought up. So one area the results has led us to reflect on is, for example, what is a computational curricula that we might think about embedding at a younger age? What does a computational curricula look like for non-data scientists? What are the foundational skills and perspectives needed for a world that's saturated by data? But in addition to this kind of straightforward approach to data literacy, we're intrigued that our participants were able to move somewhat seamlessly between talking about what does the data tell us and what do we lay on top of our data in the stories that we tell, or what stories do we look to authenticate with data. So this led us to think more about how probabilities, such in our quote about probable truths, and possibilities rub up against each other. So probabilities being more something in the language of a data scientist, and possibilities possibly more in the language of someone coming from a design discipline. So how do those kind of rub up against each other? As a personal confession, I have tended to view approaches of data determinism and data constructivism as being kind of fundamentally at odds, but perhaps it's more interesting to think about the ways that they can animate each other. And this resonates with questions around what design adds or could add to civic technology. Our participants were approaching design, as I said, mainly as a process, as a set of steps to get through, or as a profession embodied in a single person that was added to a team. So in the same space that we're thinking about what computational literacy looks like for non-data scientists, what does design literacy mean for non-designers? For example, could maybe metaphors of design help us move beyond some of the limitations that the space of business metaphors has encountered? So although most of our discussion around literacy for our participants focused on data literacy and hints of design literacy, this begs a similar question about what is civic literacy? What does that become in light of these changes? In a world where the public is the data, how does civic literacy change for us? And as a final reflection on literacy, what then would it mean to move beyond literacy to fluency in these areas? If literacy suggests a competency with rules and context, then fluency suggests an ability to reinvent and reframe. So perhaps fluency is the ability to understand not just the stories that we want to tell, but an appreciation of what our stories tell about us. So in returning to our motivating questions, hopefully the results I've shared have gone a little way to illustrating how practitioners on the ground in Atlanta have been approaching civic tech. But for the last question about how our approach of speculative and public design, how that attends to civic tech, we'll end with just 3 additional reflections. So first, we found discussions around midterm futures. I mentioned that was difficult for our participants. Yet when we stopped and thought about some of the on-the-ground work that they were doing, we realized that a lot of it actually is speculative work. For example, we could think about hackathons as really public speculations about possible futures. And this caused Thomas Lodato in our studio to suggest that maybe we should be investigating not just what projects from hackathons get taken up, and those are the successful implementations, but we should really be looking at all the projects that remain concepts and projects that maybe gain traction but then fade away. And in a similar spirit, we can use the design process as a means not just for talking around issues, but a means for dialogue through the experimentation. So most of our participants were using design as a process, as a means to an end to solve problems or to generate opportunities, yet it's not a very grand step then to step back and say that it is to look at the means as an end in itself, to draw out how the act of designing is a form of deliberating over values and constraints. So we're not the first to point out, for example, that one of the benefits of hackathons for public good is that participants learn about their city in a deeper way. They learn about why things are structured in some ways, they learn why some decisions are taken and not others, and they learn about a lot of the institutional material constraints of the city. And finally, although most of our participants were very instrumental in the way that they approached data design and civics, where they navigated between how do we solve problems of today and how do we look to the future, we did see some evidence of the curious at play. We had one participant in particular that we started calling data curious. He joined hackathons partly because he had this desire that he wanted to do good for his community, but he also just wanted to explore questions about his city, and he just wanted to play around with different data sets. So he wasn't doing anything overtly destabilizing or provocative in the line of many works that we considered to be speculative, but he was playing a bit at the margins, and we wondered how could we support this type of exploration more. Could it, for example, maybe mediate between the stalemate that I described earlier about data holders saying we have data, what do you want, and data seekers saying we want data, what do you have, but could that kind of curiosity help mediate that tension? And so I would just end with the question of what does it mean, or what would it mean to use data and design for an approach to civics marked by curiosity? So, thank you.
I can give a short question if you'd like to. So, fascinating work, Andy Chinique from Hitachi. You talk about this dynamic between almost the data providers and the data users. I'm curious if in this mix, especially at the civic level, if there's this role of a data maintainer or a data facilitator who is this connective tissue between these two roles.
Yeah, that was what we saw, the connector voice. And that was really fascinating to see how the connector voice in some ways started out as sort of being this mediator and connecting the two, and then how that mediating role itself then started to take on a kind of a power role, a sort of gatekeeper to what sources they were teeing up for use. So that was just an interesting role that kind of emerged from this. We can talk at the beer. All right.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting work. A quick note that you might be interested in if you don't know already is that the Journal of Community Informatics is coming out with a special issue on data literacy, which might be really interesting. I've been following this conversation. One question I had was about who, like if we're talking about data literacy, who are the most important civic actors in a way? Or are we talking about like kind of just everybody should know this stuff, which seems to me what you're talking about, like let's just start teaching people, you know, in preschool or kindergarten data literacy? Or are there certain groups that are civic actors, let's say the people that maybe are more discriminated against with large data sets that might be more important to empower, or the people that, like I think about journalists who are the public storytellers who are more important to empower. So I didn't know if you had some thoughts about that.
I mean, I guess my first reaction would be I would say as everyone, and I like thinking about, you know, I've been listening to some of the sessions about teaching programming at a really young age, and so I like to think about, well, what does that mean in terms of how we conceptualize data and how we use it and what that means. But I think that's an interesting point too, to think about that there are different groups that are going to approach it for different means, and it will probably mean something differently in all those contexts. Thank you.